Great. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest OnBoard board management webinar from Passageways, Life After WeWork. Where do boards go from here? The drama surrounding WeWork and its failed IPO largely focused on the outsized personality of its founder, but it was the actions taken by the company's board of directors that will form the basis of many books, keynotes, research papers, and analyses for years to come. After all, as a recent Forbes article noted, the board is the bigger WeWork story, not the new or old CEOs. We are happy to have with us today Dr. Will Sparks, a board consultant and established subject matter expert on board governance, to give us a brief overview of what happened at WeWork, as well as a deep dive into governance in the post-WeWork era. My name is Michael E. Rubin, your moderator and a member of the OnBoard board management software team. We do have a little housekeeping before we begin. First, within the coming days, we will send out a recording of the webinar, and you will also be able to download the presentation. Next, during the webinar, please feel free to enter your questions right in the GoToMeeting panel marked questions. We promised we will try to get to as many of your questions during the webinar today. Again, when you have a question, please feel free to enter it in the tab marked questions. Lastly, we plan to give away many copies of Dr. Sparks' latest book, Actualized Leadership. Everyone registered for this webinar will automatically be entered into a random drawing. We will notify all winners by email, so be sure to check your junk mail or spam folder early and often in the coming days. Now, I would like to do a brief introduction of Dr. Will Sparks. Dr. Sparks serves as the Dennis Thompson Chair of Leadership at the McCall School of Business at Queen's University of Charlotte, where he is a tenured professor of business and behavioral sciences and teaches courses in leadership development and human growth. He is the co-author with Peter Browning of the 2015 book, The Director's Manual, a framework for board governance, and also the sole author of Actualized Leadership, Managing Your Shadow and Manifesting Your Potential, which we will discuss briefly during the webinar as well. And now, without further ado, Dr. Sparks, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon to everyone. I appreciate you being here on the call and the webinar, and I look forward to discussing this with you. I'm going to do my best to provide an overview of what happened, and it's an ongoing saga, so the conclusion is yet to be written. But where we are right now with WeWork, and look at it from maybe two lenses. The first lens would be from a board governance perspective. In 2016, I co-authored the book, The Director's Manual, a framework for board governance, with my colleague and business partner, Peter Browning. And Peter has served on 15 publicly traded boards, including Lowe's, and he's the retired lead director for Nucor Steel, among many others. He's been the CEO of 2 publicly traded companies, and so he is a guru when it comes to board governance. The second lens I would like to add is where my research and emphasis comes in, and that's looking at leadership style and culture, specifically in this regard, board culture. So what happened from a human dynamics perspective that allowed the collapse of an organization with some staggering numbers that I'm going to talk about here in just a moment to set the context. But the point I'm trying to make, that I really want to make today, is, was it a board governance issue? Yes. Was it a very charismatic, often erratic leader issue? Yes. But we need to also think about our own style and what drives us, so that we are weary against these kinds of things that perhaps not at the level that we're seeing at WeWork, but we can have these similar kinds of issues come up in our life if we're not creating the right kind of culture and managing what I call our leadership shadow. So we'll get into that here in a moment. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to give you an opportunity to complete a free online assessment. It's very short. It'll take you a minute or less to complete, and that'll give you a quick insight into your style and your shadow and the relationship to that to culture, whether it's at the board level, division, team, department, family, or entire organization. But let's start by talking about WeWork and what happened. WeWork is echoing many of the examples we saw back in the dot-com bubble. It brings up a lot of really bad memories. And we see an organization that was founded in 2010, and the co-founder, a charismatic and somewhat erratic leader, Adam Newman, who was an incredible salesperson, a very driven, high-energy individual, and yet it was that shadow, I believe, that created the dynamics and the situation for this to unfold. So let's just do a kind of a quick overview of looking at some of the numbers and where we are right now. WeWork founded in 2010. Last year, WeWork lost an estimated $2 billion. And when the IPO was first announced in August of this year, they were expecting somewhere around the $47 billion valuation. That has fallen tremendously. SoftBank bought WeWork when the announcement of Andy Newman's retirement was made public with the package he took at $8 billion. They're still shooting for an IPO later this year, but of course we're running out of calendar time, and it's yet to be determined if they will move forward with their IPO, and if and when they do, what the actual value of the organization will be. Adam Newman took a staggering $1.7 billion package, and it includes an additional over $40 million a year in consulting fees for WeWork going forward. Now compare that to a workforce now of about 12,500 employees, and they are expecting layoffs that could be as high as 6,000, roughly one half of their entire workforce, and the devastation that that certainly is going to create in the lives of those workers as well. So what happened? How could this have happened? It really does come down to a board governance issue. As easy and tempting as it might be to really blame the kind of cult of personality on Adam Newman, and certainly I think there's plenty of blame to go there. The board has a responsibility to manage that kind of behavior and to ensure that there's independent, objective oversight and just good internal controls to prevent some of what we saw happen occur. For example, Adam Newman's wife, who is Gwyneth Paltrow's cousin, had a senior leadership role in the organization, as did other family members and close friends, both senior leaders in the organization and on the board. That's obviously conflict of interest there, lacking independence, which is one of the hallmarks today of good board governance, is having an independent board of directors. Moreover, there were conflicts of interest in some of the financial transactions that occurred, and many of the buildings that WeWork rented space, Adam Newman and other members of the senior team owned the buildings or owned a certain interest in those buildings. And so again, you just see kind of one mistake after the other as far as a lack of objectivity, a lack of independence, and kind of the saga of ongoing conflict of interest. So there's that going on. And one of the leadership issues, and we'll get into this in just a moment here, is that these charismatic leaders can sometimes create what's known as a reality distortion field. And so they're so charismatic and they're such a powerful force of nature. But a Forbes article recently reminds us, though, that reality always wins in the end. Reality always wins in the end. And so while there could be a temporary distortion of reality brought on by a charismatic leader, ultimately we're going to see the market correct. And so investors began having serious questions when they were releasing some of their documents leading up to the IPO, when they started digging into the huge financial losses, some fairly exorbitant spending on the part of the leadership team, and then the conflict of interest that have been cited in many articles that I wanted to just briefly touch on here. Again, all of this leading toward the tragic loss of roughly 50% of the workforce, and the eventual, what will happen again is to be determined. So those personal ownership pieces, the conflict of interest, the lavish spending and the like, have brought us to this point where Mr. Newman is a billionaire, but the other 6,000 employees will be looking for work elsewhere. But from a board governance perspective, I do want to end on a little bit of a high note here, because we have seen that the board, because of these serious issues that have been raised, have responded to investor concerns. And so, for example, one of the clauses that had been written in is that his Adam Newman's wife, Rebecca, would direct the CEO succession process as opposed to the board directing that if her husband became permanently disabled or deceased. That responsibility clearly falls within the purview of the board of directors, and they have now taken that responsibility back, and they will assume responsibility for the CEO search if and when a new CEO is needed to move forward with the organization. The company has committed to also restricting other Newman family members from holding board seats, and they will be appointing a lead independent director by the end of the year, as well as scaling back the voting rights that Mr. Newman currently has. Although he's retired, he's still engaged in some of the day-to-day operations of the organization. So governance matters. Conflict of interest matters. Good independent leadership matters both at the board level and at the executive level of the organization. Michael Rubin commented on this earlier. There are case studies that will be written and books that will be written about this implosion for years to come, I'm sure with a lot more detail and insight than where we are right now. But we do have enough to know that there were some serious board issues. And so while it's a little bit salacious for us on the sidelines to sort of watch this from an entertainment perspective, my point in all of this is that, hey, but what about us? Is it just that just happened sort of randomly, or do we sometimes create that or have the possibility of creating some degree of that dysfunction in our own organizations and in our own boards? So my research over the last 20 plus years has focused on understanding leader style and what I call leadership shadows. That concept is based on the work of the famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who's credited with a number of terms that he created: the collective shadow, archetypes, synchronicity. If you've ever referred to yourself as introverted or extroverted, the Myers-Briggs type indicator is a direct result of Carl Jung's work, tremendous force in the field of human behavior. And his concept of the individual shadow really influenced my work in this area. It's kind of the Mr. or Mrs. Hyde to our Dr. Jekyll. We have a certain persona that we try to project to the world as our Dr. Jekyll, and yet we also know lurking somewhere in the background is that Mr. or Mrs. Hyde. And knowing that and having that awareness actually liberates us from that cycle and allows us to create not only higher performance in ourselves, but when we think about working with others, whether it's at the board level, the team level, the division, or the department level, ultimately healthy cultures. So what I'd like to do on the next couple of slides is begin introducing an opportunity for you all to complete the free assessment, so you'll have something as we navigate through the next 20 minutes or so looking at this material. So if we can advance to the next slide, what I'd like to do is offer an opportunity for you to complete this free assessment, and there are two ways that you can do that. The first way is you can text Will Sparks to the number 36260. If you just text Will Sparks to 36260, that will bring up the app, and you can just add that to your home screen. And once you have downloaded the app on your home screen, if you open it, you will see where the purple arrow is there. It says ALP survey. That is the free survey. Along with that, I've got a number of resources related to personal and team development. All of that is applicable for board performance and board improvement, as well as a link to my 2018 TEDx talk, The Power of Self-Awareness. So you can text Will Sparks to 36260, or you can go over to www.alpfree, all lowercase, one word, alpfree.com. And you can click on the purple rectangle at the bottom to take that quick free survey, and that will that's your information. You can save a picture of it or do whatever you would like with that information. That begins to introduce the
Will,
style.
begging your pardon for one moment, just so a little housekeeping note. If you go to the chat tab on your GoToWebinar panel, we've also included the link there. You can go ahead and click that, alpfree.com, whatever is easiest for you, but just wanted to make that note that the URL is also in the GoToMeeting chat panel. And again, just a reminder as well, a general reminder that please feel free to use the questions panel to ask any questions that you have. We will be probably batching most of them at the end, but if there's an especially relevant question that comes in, we'll go ahead and insert that into, we'll ask that of Dr. Sparks as soon as possible as well. So again, the ALP free link is in the chat tab and the question tab. Please feel free to use that at any time to ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and we'll begin looking at the three styles of leaders, the three corresponding shadows, and the impact they have on culture. And the first style that we're going to look at is the achiever style. And so we've got a polling question to ask you what your style is, and so we'll take a look at those results as we move forward.
Just so everyone knows, the poll question has come up. You should see that having popped up, say, what is your leadership style, with some options for you. So go ahead and submit that. And as we get the results in, we'll go ahead and share those during the presentation as well.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so the achiever style, that is the green style that you have here. These individuals are those that are driven by the need for recognition and the like. They are high individual achievers, as you can guess by the name. Famous achievers that have been profiled by Harvard Business Review include Michael Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates, a number of famous individuals, all extremely successful, focused on improvement, very disciplined as well. And you can see there in the light the actualized achiever at your best. But the shadow of an achiever is a fear of failure. And so if you notice then the shadow traits, how those light traits go dark under stress. And so detailed oriented becomes narrow-minded. Organized becomes inflexible. And you can go down and across for all of these to see the impact that these have on performance. Now, a couple of things I want to say about all three, whether it is the achiever, the affirmer, or the asserter. There's a concept called paradoxical intent, and this was created and at first identified by Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust and went on to write a best-selling book, and one that I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It's called Man's Search for Meaning, again by Viktor Frankl. It is the only textbook in the Wharton MBA leadership course. It's that powerful and that insightful. There are a number of insights that Viktor Frankl provides in that book about human nature and the human condition. But for our purposes this afternoon, I think what's most important is the notion of paradoxical intent, which is simply this. The more we fear something, the more likely we are to experience it. Think about that for just a moment. He said that's the tragic irony of the human condition. The more we fear something, the more likely we are to experience it. Carl Jung said it a slightly different way. He said we meet our destiny on the road we took to avoid it. And in this regard, take a look at the right side of that graph. Narrow-minded, inflexible, rigid, obsessive, critical. The achiever is a classic micromanager under stress. And the culture that they create, again, whether it's in the entire organization, team, department, or maybe in this case, in the boardroom, is a detached culture. The person that has the highest need for recognition actually creates the lowest performing culture, again, that is detached. Members withdraw, there's psychological and physical withdrawal from the group. People feel angry, they're apathetic, they're being micromanaged, and it is a low performing culture where people are looking for ways to either sidetrack the conversation or leave the group altogether. And again, the irony being when you let your shadow drive your behavior, you're more likely to experience the very thing you're trying to avoid, in this case, failure. The second style is the Affirmer style, and that is the red image that you'll see on the next slide. The Affirmer style is relationship driven. So the achiever is recognition driven, the affirmer is relationship driven. These individuals are warm, friendly, empathetic, always there to listen, to encourage, to support. They truly have the servant leader mind and heart. In many ways, affirmers make life and work worth showing up for. Famous affirmers profiled by Harvard Business School include Ellen DeGeneres, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, many from a faith-based perspective. And if you are old enough to remember, like I am, Peanuts and Snoopy, Charlie Brown was one of the public, kind of a classic cultural icon that is a classic affirmer they identified. These individuals, again, are very relationship driven, but the shadow of an affirmer is a fear of rejection. And under stress, affirmers go dark when friendly becomes conflict avoidant, empathy becomes indecisive, loyal becomes dependent, overly accommodating, jealous. And so these light colors go dark, or light attributes go dark under stress, and things that trigger the shadow of an affirmer are things like the prospect of conflict, having to have a difficult conversation with someone, saying no to someone who is used to you always saying yes, or being overly accommodating. So affirmers, the developmental opportunity for them is to really work on establishing and enforcing healthy boundaries. But from a board culture perspective, the culture that an affirmer creates is what I call a dramatic culture. A dramatic culture is warm and friendly on the surface, but beneath that friendliness and that warmness is frustration and ultimately despair. Because affirmers tend to smooth over differences. If there's conflict, they'll say, hey, we're going to take that offline. We'll talk about that offline. They tend to avoid having those difficult conversations. Oftentimes, there's a lower performing board member or team member who's not pulling his or her weight, and they're allowed to kind of slide on. And that creates that level of frustration and angst within the board or whatever the group setting may be. And so for the affirmer, the shadow, the one thing that you're trying to avoid, failure, becomes more likely if you, rejection becomes more likely if you allow that shadow to drive your behavior. I'll give a quick example with an individual that I knew very well a few years ago. He worked for a Fortune 50 company, very big company, and was promoted up to the senior executive level. He was an off-the-chart affirmer, had an intensely high score, one of the nicest people you would ever meet, but they were asking him to bring a contrary view and perspective to the discussion. And he also had a performance issue with a low-performing colleague who was also a friend, and he was navigating, trying to manage that with coaching and the like, and delayed making a difficult decision, which was, most people agreed, he should release that individual who wasn't performing at his or her capability. The irony in this is because he was unwilling to do that, he experienced the rejection or separation that he feared because he was asked to retire early from this organization about 3 to 4 years before he was ready to retire. So he experienced that rejection, again, by not being able to embrace conflict and have those difficult decisions. So you see that cycle of paradoxical intent play out quite often. But from a culture perspective and a board dynamics perspective, you have to, here is the group decision-making pitfall that you're likely to fall into is called the Abilene paradox, and it's essentially the board's inability to manage agreement. So the board, someone suggests something, everyone agrees publicly, but privately they think it's a bad idea, and yet they fail to communicate that truly and candidly to the board. So the board ends up making a decision and moving forward, and off you go to what's known a trip to Abilene. Nobody really wants to go, and yet somehow the board goes along with the leader, the CEO, or in this case it could be a director. Can be a very costly dysfunction to occur and to manage out of. And then finally, the third style that I want to cover, and what I think is probably the most common at the C-suite level in corporate America, and I know that the culture that they create is the most common from 22 years of research, is the asserter style and the blue slide. The asserter style is sort of the classic leader that we often associate with business and, quite frankly, with just performance in general. So these individuals have often found themselves in leadership roles throughout their entire lives, whether it was in school or hobbies or sports, academics. They've often raised their hand to take leadership roles. The icon on this slide is meant to indicate on your leadership report Thor's hammer. So there's kind of this ultimate need for power and control. These individuals are results oriented. And so at their best, they're confident, decisive, competitive, candid, courageous, willing to take a risk. And so these individuals, again, can be incredibly charismatic at their best. The shadow of an asserter, however, is a fear of betrayal. It's a fear of vulnerability. And so these light attributes at their best go dark under stress. Some of the common triggers that trigger the fear of betrayal shadow for an asserter include things like having to admit that you're wrong, having to ask for forgiveness, saying you're sorry, having to ask for help, not being able to do everything by yourself, or perhaps not being able to help someone that you are well-intentioned, but for whatever reason, you're not able to help this individual. That triggers that fear of betrayal shadow. But it's especially the prospect of being wrong. So famous asserters that have been profiled by Harvard Business Review include Dr. Martin Luther King, Serena Williams, the Jack Welch, former CEO of General Electric, GE, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton back in 2016 were profiled as very strong needs for power, which is the asserter style. So you see that quite often in high levels of leadership within organizations. But the shadow there, that fear of betrayal, those negative attributes that go dark when the shadow is activated, arrogance, impatience, controlling, blunt, skeptical, that creates a dependent or codependent culture within the boardroom or within the entire organization. The underlying emotion of a dependent culture is fear and anxiety. Members are afraid to challenge the leader. They are afraid to, if they step out of line, they're afraid they may get knocked down a bit. So they tend to over-rely on the judgment and the experience of the leader, afraid to challenge him or her, and they often suffer from groupthink, which is when there's conformity pressure that's placed on a group, or in this case a board, to make a decision and move forward when others have serious doubts. The classic case study from Harvard that we use to teach groupthink is the tragedy of the Challenger disaster in 1986, when Morton Thiokol, the subcontractor that manufactured the O-rings on the rockets, were concerned about the cooler temperatures, but they felt enormous pressure by NASA to make a recommendation to move forward with the launch, even after they had voiced their concerns. Tragically, they did that, and we know, again, the loss of human life and the tragic outcome of that. I mentioned that this is also the most common culture that I see in my 22 years of research, and I can tell you that it's everywhere from a Fortune 10 company or a Fortune 10 board of directors all the way down to a nonprofit, church, synagogue, mid-sized business, you name it, even family situations. It's that kind of leader that can't get out of his or her own way once they've achieved a certain amount of success. The challenge with this from a board perspective is that folks are often intimidated or afraid to speak up or to challenge the leader. And that's why independence is so important at the board level for governance. I don't know this, I haven't assessed it, but based on what I've read and based on what I know about the WeWork situation, if I were to hazard a guess, I would suspect that that board had been operating in primarily a dependent culture mode. There was a lack of independence. There was just seemed to be kind of going along with the flow, overlooking or bypassing obvious conflicts of interest that were there, and not providing enough independent and critical reaction to the former CEO that allowed this behavior to continue, and ultimately got us to where we are now, which is, again, the conclusion remains to be seen, but it's gone from 47 billion down to 8 billion as bought by SoftCell. So these are critical factors for us to consider in our lives. And we see the example of WeWork as kind of something that has captured the media attention for a number of different reasons. And that's important to learn, and there will be a number of cases and books that will be written about this going forward. But I would hazard to guess, though, that it is really incumbent on all of us, though, to step back from that and say, well, what is my style? What is my shadow? And am I creating less than optimal boards or cultures in my places of work, whether it's in the boardroom, at home, or whatever the context may be? And if so, what can I do to get out of my own way? And so what I'd like to do is close out the formal part of the presentation with what I call the anecdotes for the shadow and those suboptimal cultures, and then we'll take a look at the polling results and open it up for some Q&A. So if we go back to the achiever style for just a moment and think about that high need for perfection, very detailed, very focused on the task at hand, and yet they micromanage under stress. The anecdote for the fear of failure is abundance. A very famous book that's out now is Mindset by Dweck, and it talks about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And in many ways, she's getting at this concept of abundance in a growth mindset. And so if you're an achiever and you can begin to tap more into a growth or an abundance mindset, you begin to reframe the world as us versus them, or a win-lose, zero-sum kind of mindset. You can change it to a win-win mindset where you can celebrate someone else's victories without feeling upset or jealous, knowing that there's plenty to go around for all. And so if you are an actualized achiever and you tap into that abundance, you're much less likely to go dark when things aren't perfect. You're willing to let go. And even if you have to force yourself, you delegate to others, knowing that micromanaging is ultimately going to bring about, if not outright failure, suboptimal success. For the Affirmer style and the fear of rejection shadow, the anecdote is connection. But it's not connection to anything external. It's connection to your own internal purpose. When you are connected to a profound sense of your own purpose and you live and you lead from that perspective, it makes having difficult conversations easier. When an affirmer defaults to what's the right thing to do for the board, for the organization, or for this individual, then giving negative feedback or critical feedback, managing conflict, saying no, enforcing healthy boundaries, all of that becomes much easier for the affirmer when he or she have connected to their own internal barometer of purpose and care a little bit less about the approval of others, rather defaulting to what's most important for the organization and ultimately for their own purpose. And then finally, for the asserter and the fear of betrayal shadow, the anecdote for that is what I like to call the sense of assurance. Assurance is essentially psychological safety. So a fear of vulnerability, the affirmer style, for example, is usually will more easily step into vulnerability. That's extremely painful for an asserter. An asserter likes to be right, they like to be in charge, and they often see vulnerability as weakness. And yet, if you, like 45 other million people that have seen the #1 most viewed TED Talk in the world, is Brené Brown's 2010 TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. And she's gone on to write a number of best-selling books and has, worldwide tours promoting her books since that TED Talk was published. She reminds us that while it may sometimes feel excruciating to experience vulnerability, it's absolutely required for authentic connection with others when we're leading others, again, whether at the board level or at the division or department or entire organizational level. So tapping into this notion of assurance where we feel safe, letting our guard down, asking for help, or saying we don't know, creates the space for more dynamic performance at the board level and allows us to break out of the fear and anxiety that often undermine our best intentions when we create that codependent mindset that often leads to groupthink in the boardroom, usually with the dependent culture. So if you're interested in the book, I do talk about those anecdotes in great detail. I've also profiled a number of leaders that have taken the assessment and they lent their support to this work. Just maybe quickly, 3 leaders if you're interested. Kathy Besant, who was just voted the most powerful woman in banking, is the Chief Operations and Chief Technology Officer at Bank of America. She gave a great interview on the need for candor, greater candor in organizations. Fred Whitfield is the president and vice chairman of the Charlotte Hornets, and he's been Michael Jordan's right-hand man for the last 30-plus years, and he gives a great interview on the need for focus as an actualized achiever. And then finally, the Most Reverend Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry. If you happen to watch the Royal Wedding, he gave the sermon for that, and he gives a great interview on the need for courage and how that allows us to ultimately step into our highest potential, both as leaders and just as human beings. So hopefully there'll be something there that might be of interest to you. So with that, that's all I've got from a content perspective. I wanted to leave time to look at the polling results and also open it up for any questions and discussion.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you. We definitely appreciate this, Will. Super informative, and your conclusions on WeWork. It'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out. But the insight analysis you provided was absolutely just spot on and riveting. That the board took action and assumed leadership. So, as both of us have mentioned, it will definitely fill many textbooks, case studies, so on and so forth. It'll be a race to see who can get all that in first. So we did get a few questions come in, so I'll go ahead and read those. But there's still time. If you'd like, you can enter your questions in the questions tab that's on the GoToMeeting panel, or you can use the chat if you'd like. Just make sure you're sending to the organizers. Either way, whatever is easiest for you. But yeah, please continue to send those in. We did get some results from the first panel. It was a dead heat where people chose achiever and affirmer. It looks like pretty evenly. I'm not sure. I don't think we got any other polls out there for this one, so we'll have to try that again next time. So, but first question that came in, let me go ahead and read this out for you. So the first question that came in is, it says, this is speaking generally, not just about WeWork. Do you believe that all the board members whose inaction leads to a crisis should be removed?
That's a great question. It would be easy to say yes, absolutely. The board should be completely turned over. But I don't know enough of the specifics around the situation to say that definitively. I know that there are board members that are either members of the family of Adam Newman or very close friends, and I think they should take a very hard look at that, because if you're serving on the board of a publicly traded company, then you need to have some street cred and there needs to be a track record of experience that justifies your role on the board. And so I think that they should probably do an assessment, which there are a number of grids where you can assess the areas of expertise that you need. For example, growing trend now in board governance is to make sure you have technology or a CIO expert to help with cybersecurity. That's a growing problem for every organization. So I think you would need to look at what are the areas of expertise that we need to have on the board to help facilitate our highest level of performance. I would suspect that there might be one or two that would probably fit that bill, but certainly in this case, I think there's plenty of room for some turnover. And they are going to be moving to putting a new independent lead director at the end of the year, and I think that's a very good sign. organization. Whether it's too little, too late, time will tell.
No, that's great. That's great. What about another question that came in is you were talking before about changing a culture, and you were specifically referring to the shadow style about the fear of betrayal. So the question was, is it possible for boards to change a culture if they are stuck in a fear of betrayal shadow mode with the same people? Or does change require fresh eyes and new people?
Um, the only time that I have seen a board or an organization for that matter, let's just use the term group. So that can be a board, that can be a division, department, team, organization, whatever context it is. The only time I've seen transformational growth with essentially the same people there is when the leader has a profound transformation himself or herself, and they bring that to the board. Let's use that as an example. So if a leader, and sometimes it comes about with a health crisis, it can come about with something going on in a personal arena in someone's life. Whatever occurs, sometimes, quite frankly, a person can get 360-degree feedback, and it really can feel like a punch to the gut. Whatever the case may be, if the individual leader has a moment of insight and epiphany and essentially comes to the group and says, listen, I'm going to own my bad behavior. I'm going to own my shadow behaviors and the way I've managed this group. And I promise you that we are going to make a change going forward. And they live by that change. Then I do think you can do that with essentially the same people in place, assuming that the other directors move into a higher level of engagement, which is usually the case. Having said that, if the leader, whether it's the CEO or the independent lead director or the chair, whatever the case may be, if they're not willing to change their style, especially as an asserter, then the group will never get out of the shadow of that individual. And in those cases, unless there's been a transformation at the level of leader, then I think the board or the culture of the group at whatever level is always going to defer the leader, in this case an asserter. So without that transformation of the leader, you have to turn that over in order to grow and change.
No, that's a terrific answer and great question that came in. Thank you to the person who sent that. Also, another question that came in, this one came in on the chat. Can you have more than one shadow style?
Yes, you can. Usually, and sometimes people have one at work and one at home. And so that's a question that Abraham Maslow, who's kind of the founding father, if you will, of self-actualization, his response to that was that, well, you can, but you shouldn't. You should try to integrate into your authentic self and be who you are, be authentically who you are in every arena in your life. And so let's just use this for an example. Sometimes an individual is a very strong affirmer at work. They are the nice person. They're always there to smile and to support, and they tend to be very friendly, maybe overly accommodating and the like. And then as soon as they get in their car to go home at the end of the day, that transformation occurs, and they go from being a uber affirmer to a uber asserter. And so now they're going to be in total control. It's kind of like you're the nice guy or gal at work, but then you go home and kick the dog. Well, that's a little bit like this. You begin then having this other style or other shadow in a different arena in your life. But what we're doing is we're overcompensating. So that's why Maslow said you shouldn't do that. You should try to integrate and be one authentic self, because it takes a tremendous amount of energy to overcompensate. And so we've been so much of an affirmer in one setting, we have to then be equally much as an asserter to find that balance. And so, yes, you can, and yes, it's actually fairly common. But for those that are experiencing that, it's exhausting. And so moving toward finding your true purpose, your true voice, integrating that in so that you are, if you're an affirmer, being an actualized affirmer, which means you're warm and friendly. You're always going to be relationship driven, but you're candid, direct with others. You're there to offer, critical feedback if it needs to be given. You enforce boundaries. You say no when you don't want to do something. That allows you to hold on to all of the positive attributes of an affirmer style and mitigate some of those shadow traits. And in doing that, mitigate the need to overcompensate an arena in your life.
Yeah, there actually another, it's not necessarily a question, but a comment that came in also in the chat that's related to that. This person says, I'm both an achiever and asserter. So do I need to work on both cures, quote unquote, for the negative shadow issues? Or is it relate to what you said about overcompensating?
Yeah, so if you are, someone taking that assessment, I guess you typically you're going to get one or the other, and so, but you can have, let's just use this achiever asserter. They have some things that are in common. They're both, driven to produce results. They can both be fairly impatient. They suffer from this kind of what I call the curse of perfectionism. Both micromanage under stress, and so there are a lot of commonalities with the achiever asserter style. One of the but instead of trying to work on both of those shadows, I would encourage the individual to begin developing a more self-actualized approach, because that is the easier part to grow. It's difficult if you're just trying to be something different than what you really are, but if you self-actualization, you to better manage those darker aspects of our shadows. So just in a broad statement, the achiever and the asserter tend to be more self-focused. They're more focused on their agenda. They're more focused on what's important to them, and so they may often interrupt others. They aren't really the world's best listeners, and so one way to mitigate that is to really begin taking an active interest in others. Others speak first, not interrupting, asking for feedback from others. And so if you can begin to cultivate a little bit more of that affirmer servant leader mindset, and taking more of an interest in others, it helps to soften some of those darker traits that are common to both the achiever and the assertive.
No, it's terrific. That's terrific. So we have time for one more question here. So the question is, what do you say when people tell you culture doesn't matter? Hit your numbers and the culture will take care of itself. I think I probably know your answer, but we should probably
Yeah,
just get it on the record.
yeah, I would say that in the short term, that person is probably right. That if you hit your numbers in the short term, you will, you're going to return a maximum value to shareholders. Everybody's going to make a nice bonus. You're going to be rewarded in the kind of extrinsic ways of money and all of that, and that's important. I'm not discounting that at all. I can guarantee you that in the long term, that's not sustainable. Uh, it's kind of the analogy about going out and coming up with a great strategy. But there's an old saying from, I believe it's Harvard or Wharton: culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if you have a disengaged culture, if you have a codependent culture, people are afraid to make a mistake, they're afraid to speak out, they're not being allowed to work at their fullest potential, they're going to exit the first opportunity they get. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at them. You're just not meeting those intrinsic needs that we all have to kind of, connect with others in an authentic way, to express ourselves creatively and the like. And so while I agree with the question that, it doesn't matter, I would add the caveat, it doesn't matter in the short term, but it's my professional opinion that it's not sustainable in the long term. The people that are in a less than optimal culture will exit the first chance they get, and we've seen those kind of implosions time and time again. So if you're going to take a long-term view and you're going to really encourage uh, helping individuals reach their fullest potential, and build a culture that's going to last for a long time, or performance that's going to last, I think you do have to start with culture.
No, it actually, when I read that question, it reminded me of you see that often in sports, regardless of which sport. I mean, frankly, all the major league sports, where a team that is, maybe not going well or is underperforming, they're well, all of a sudden now people, instead of using the word culture, they'll say the locker room.
Yeah.
Is kind of the shorthand, and you hear that all the time. Well, we just got to start winning, and then the locker room will take care of itself. And but meanwhile, the teams that are consistently better overperformers and reached their goals consistently, every year or that set out to hit their goal in a given year, they're the ones who talk very strongly about culture, the locker room, so to speak, and make it a priority. So no, it's
Exactly right.
interesting.
Let me, if I can,
Yeah,
just really quickly give a personal example with
please.
that. Over the years, I've worked closely with Steve Clifford, and he actually provided an endorsement quote for the book. And he's the head coach of the Orlando Magic. He used to be the head coach for the Charlotte Hornets, and he had 1 year left on his contract. And I really think we should have kept him here, but he was released, and he went back to Orlando now as the head coach last year. Last year, the Charlotte Hornets had greater talent. If you looked at the numbers and you just looked at the talent, he should have made the playoffs. He didn't. But the Orlando Magic less talent, and the reason they did is because Steve Clifford goes to great lengths to manage leadership and to build a culture where people feel heard, they feel connected. He's very candid, he's very direct with his players, but he cares about them deeply as well. And I think that's a great example of how, from a talent perspective, they didn't have what we had, and yet they made it into the playoffs. And I think they did because of the locker room or the culture that Coach Clifford was able to create.
No, that I 1,000% agree. No, thank you for that. Well, that's all the time we actually have for today. So, on behalf of OnBoard, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. And of course, I especially want to thank Dr. Will Sparks for sharing his knowledge and his expertise and his insights with us today. This was hugely fascinating and really very applicable to a lot of different situations. So, thank you very much, Dr. Sparks, for sharing all that today.
My
So,
pleasure for having
absolutely.
me.
Absolutely. So again, we will be sending out a link to the recording of today's webinar to everyone, and of course to the presentation. And we will also enter everyone who has registered. We will enter them into a random drawing for a free copy of Dr. Sparks's book. Again, we would just love everyone's feedback in general. So please take a moment when the question is put to you about filling out a survey. We really would appreciate if you take just 1 or 2 minutes, not a huge amount of time, but really just take a few minutes to fill out that survey at the end. It really helps us make improvements and also, decide on which topics to pursue next. And with that, thank you again for joining us, and we bid you a very cordial good afternoon. Thank you.